Foreign interference is therefore a complex and enduring threat to Canada's sovereignty. I can assure you that CSIS takes all allegations of foreign interference very seriously and uses its authorities under the CSIS Act to investigate, provide advice to government, and where appropriate, take measures to reduce the threat. Building resilience to foreign interference is one way to mitigate its coercive effects. CSIS has spoken publicly in a variety of forums to warn Canadians about these threats and these techniques and inform them of ways they can protect themselves. We have also provided defensive briefings to elected officials from all orders of government across Canada. Perhaps most central to these efforts is our engagement with Canadian communities. We have been clear that the principal threat to Canada comes from the People's Republic of China. But to be clear, the threat does not come from the Chinese people, but rather from the Chinese Communist Party and the government of China. Indeed, we are keenly aware that Chinese communities are often the primary victims of PRC foreign interference efforts in Canada. Le service continue aussi à investir.
We therefore continue to invest significant effort in building relationships with individuals, communities, and community leaders to establish and sustain trust and to offer our support and partnership in their protection. Furthermore, these efforts are not limited to Chinese-Canadian communities.
I would like to conclude by stating that CSIS takes allegation of unauthorized release of classified information very seriously. Compromises of this kind can reveal sensitive sources, methodologies, and techniques to Canada's adversaries. They are listening. This can subsequently threaten the integrity of our operations and even the physical safety and security of human sources and employees. Ultimately, such releases can hinder our ability to protect Canadians. Therefore, I would like to remind the committee that, just as with other recent appearances in front of PROC and other committees here, I am limited in what we can say in an unclassified setting. CSIS cannot publicly, in fact, prohibited from commenting on operational matters and classified information in order to protect the safety and security of Canadians. Nonetheless, I welcome this opportunity for a frank and transparent discussion to the extent possible on the foreign interference threats to Canada that Canada faces, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vigneault. And so we will start with our 6-minute rounds. It will start with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Romanado, suivi par Madame Goudreau, et puis Mr. Julian.
Goudreau, Ms. Normandin, rather,
Et puis Mr.
and then
Julian.
Mr.
I would
Julian.
just remind everyone that comments should go through the chair, and there should be one voice being heard at a time. Mr. Cooper, 6 minutes to you.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses, and I would like to just express and associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Vigneault in saying that the interference that we see and the threat posed by the Beijing Communist Party has nothing to do with Chinese Canadians who are victims of the regime and their interference activities. It's very important we keep that in mind at all times during this our deliberations on this matter. Mr. Vigneault, how many times did CSIS brief the Prime Minister regarding Beijing's interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections?
And Madam Chair, I have been director of CSIS since 2017. I have had many opportunities to brief the Prime Minister, Cabinet, and different ministers on the subject of national security, including specifically on foreign interference. I would not have a specific breakdown of the number of times since 2017, but this has been a topic of ongoing briefings.
Will you undertake then to provide the committee with a list of all the dates that you briefed the Prime Minister, that CSIS briefed the Prime Minister in regards to interference activities by Beijing related to the 2019 and 2021 elections?
So, Madam Chair, I understand that yesterday the National Security Intelligence Advisor was asked for a similar request. And my reaction to this would be, to probably work with the Privy Council office to have a consolidated response to the committee through you, Madam Chair.
And will you also undertake to do the same with respect to a list of all the dates that CSIS briefed any minister, PMO staff, minister's office staff, or security cleared Liberal Party staff related to Beijing's interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections?
So, Madam Chair, I think, as just mentioned, we will endeavor to collide as much of that information possible. And bearing any specific national security considerations, we will endeavor to provide as much as possible to the committee.
Okay, and I guess consistent with that, or in addition to that, will you undertake to provide a list of all individuals who are present at these briefings to the degree that this is possible?
I will probably have to defer to the extent to which we know. We will again, provide the information in the context of any other national security considerations. But we'll probably have to rely also on the Privy Council office for some of the attendance of these briefings. So that consolidated piece will hopefully be answering many of these questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. On February 24th, 2023, Sam Cooper of Global News reported that 3 weeks before the 2019 election, CSIS officials gave an urgent briefing to senior aides in the Prime Minister's office, warning them that a Liberal candidate who is a sitting Liberal MP now had received assistance from Beijing's Toronto consulate in his nomination campaign. What are the names of the PMO aides who were briefed?
Madam Chair, as I just indicated, we'll have to review the list of the dates of such briefings. It will be important to remind colleagues that I will, or this committee, I should say, that I do not take the premise of that the question at face value. I need to be able to provide information respecting the proper classification of the information, so that the spirit of that question will be answered through the consolidated response.
And to that end, did CSIS brief the Prime Minister?
CSIS, as I mentioned.
No, but specifically in relation to the 2019 circumstances surrounding a Liberal candidate and Beijing's consulate in Toronto assisting him in his nomination campaign.
So maybe, Madam Chair, on that question, I think it's important to put in context that information that is in the public domain may or may not be coming from the service or from other agencies. There's been indeed information that is now reported by the media, and it is not because the information is in the media that I'm at liberty to confirm or deny the specific nature of classified information. So along these lines, I will not be able to provide a specific answer to
I understand
that
that
allegation.
you're not able to provide a specific answer at this time, but again, would you undertake to go back and provide this committee with any date or dates that the Prime Minister was briefed on this matter?
I will be able to provide, Madam Chair, a consolidated response to PCO of dates where the subject of foreign interference was discussed. However, I am not at liberty to disclose information directly or indirectly that would provide classified information in a public setting. So there will be limit, Madam Chair, to the specificity of the topic discussed. But as I said, I think it's important that people understand that foreign interference was indeed briefed regularly.
Okay, and the same would apply with respect to Liberal Party staff or other officials who may have been briefed. If you could also undertake that, if they were briefed, to come back to this committee, having regard for what you had previously said, unless it doesn't apply in that case.
We will, I think, in the spirit of these hearings, Madam Chair, we will absolutely endeavor to provide the most consolidated and thorough response possible to the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mrs. Romanado, up to 6 minutes for you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today and for providing the information that they are able to, because I understand full well, given security issues, we can't publicly discuss in public things that we do not have clearance for. My first question is for Mr. Vigneault. I'd like to know a little bit about the tools that CSIS has to disrupt foreign interference. And in the Rosenberg report that was released this week, it says that one of the options CSIS has is to engage with diplomats who may try to interfere in our elections. So if a foreign official was trying to interfere in our election, does CSIS have the tools in its mandate to address that?
So thank you for the question. And Madam Chair, through you, I would say that the CSIS Act provides a number of tools for CSIS to investigate foreign interference activities, including when it comes to diplomats posted in Canada. We are, as an intelligence service, our professional are looking at the best way possible to get at the intelligence, using all the techniques that are available to us. And when we do face questions or situation where there's a specific threat activity, we are also using, and we have used, and will continue to use, our threat reduction measures mandate to engage in those activities. We will often, work with partners. We will not work in isolation because, these issues are very complex, and you do not want to take an action and have unintended consequences. So we work in partnership. So in this case, when it comes time to diplomat, we would likely be working with the Department of Global Affairs Canada, GAC, to do so. But I can assure the committee that, as I said in my opening remarks, that CSIS and our partners at this table, we do take any allegations of foreign interference extremely seriously. We investigate these allegations, and we use all the tools at our disposal to try to better understand, characterize these activities, and reduce the threat where possible.
Okay, and thank you very much. CSIS has the ability to share information with the RCMP for them to launch an investigation. Is that correct?
Yes, CSIS is actually over the years, since the inception of CSIS in 1984, we have developed between the CSIS and the RCMP very elaborate processes to be able to share information. I think the committee has heard some of the challenges that exist in using intelligence and passing it on to law enforcement agencies or investigative bodies, because intelligence is not a question of evidence. So, the RCMP in this specific case needs to determine how to use the information and further their own investigation. It is a complex process. The two organizations working with Department of Justice continue to work on this issue. The notion of using intelligence to pursue law enforcement matters continues to be a challenge that a number of organizations are actively working on. But we do have robust processes with the RCMP and with other law enforcement and investigative bodies to do such an exchange.
So on that, Mr. Vigneault, I'm sure you're aware that yesterday the Deputy Minister of Public Safety confirmed that there are actually no investigations into allegations of foreign interference from the last election underway. So based on your previous response that information is shared, what they have in front of them, they do not have any active investigations. I'd like to just talk a little bit about the briefings next. You mentioned that you do participate in briefings of the panel. Do you personally do that briefing, or is that somebody else on your team or along with you?
I normally, I'm the one who would be doing these briefings. There may have been one or two that my colleague, Deputy Director of Operations, may have undertook, but it will be myself briefing the panel directly.
Okay, and from what I understand, based on those briefings, there has been no incident or incidents of interference that have threatened the integrity of the election. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, it's indeed the conclusion that the panel has taken. They received a lot of information, a lot of briefings, and the panel can tell you, having been part of the discussions, have been challenging us on our information, on better understanding, the panel members wanting to better understand what we had. And I can tell you that it has been a very robust exchange. And the committee, the panel have come to conclusions in 2019 and also for the elections in 2021 that indeed the information did not reach that threshold. And based on my information and my experience, for what it's worth, Madam Chair, I would say that I concur with that conclusion.
Perfect. And I have only about 30 seconds left. You mentioned that you could not comment on media reports that may or may not have come from CSIS, whether it be leaks and so on and so forth. As you probably know, my son is an intelligence officer of the Canadian Armed Forces, and I take the issue of security and national security extremely seriously. Could you explain quickly what a leak could mean to the intelligence sharing of Five Eyes, and what would that happen if we were to have leaks of top secret information?
So, Madam Chair, very quickly, I would say that the bread and butter of an intelligence organization is our ability to collect secrets and keep secrets and use those secrets, with the appropriate people. When that ability is threatened, it undermines the confidence of our partners domestically and internationally. And this is something we take very seriously. But I would say it's also the ability of to protect our people and our sources, people who put their lives at risk to protect Canada.
So would you say
Thank
that
you. Sorry.
letting information
time.
like this out would actually put our members of the Canadian Armed Forces at risk?
If you can give it in one answer, I would take it.
I would say that any information that is undisclosed in an unauthorized way, you do not know the consequences. You cannot foresee the consequences down the road. So I think it's very serious.
Thank you. I have
matter.
to end our time there, and I would just like to keep it tight. I will go, Madame Normandin, jusqu'à 6 minutes.
Ms. Normandin, 6 minutes. Thank you very much to all of the witnesses for being here. You just mentioned that it's a hypothetical situation where there are leaks, but in fact we had a leak apparently to Global, and this has serious consequences. But is it perhaps because that the people who had that information were dissatisfied with how the information was handled by CSIS or the government? And does it say something about the tensions that might exist? Madam Chair, I would say that in an intelligence agency like ours, there are always different points of view and very serious discussions. But I want to assure the committee that issues dealing directly with interference constitute a very important issue, and we discuss them very seriously with all of our people, so there's no problem there. There are measures in CSIS for people who are dissatisfied with how information is being handled to use a process to deal with that. We have in CIRA as well a complaint process to deal with classified information. So there are processes and forums for people to explore these concerns. It's not an issue that there is this kind of tension within CSIS. Thank you. I want to come back to the issue of donations to the Trudeau Foundation. We know that when the Chinese government is making donations, it's because it is political interference. How do you deal with this, and do they come to CSIS directly, these kind of complaints? This is an important question, and it's a complex matter with respect to the foundation in question. I believe it operates at arm's length from the government, so it is not something that CSIS would get involved with directly. That said, if we are aware of information involving a foreign actor that is undertaking disruption activities or interference, then we can take action. On the specific question, CSIS doesn't necessarily have the last word because depending on the situation, there may be other agencies, organizations involved. But In my experience, CSIS is involved in the discussions. Thank you. You mentioned in your opening remarks that when it is appropriate, one of the roles of CSIS is to counter threats. What happens in those situations, and who else has a role to play in deciding whether those steps are taken? Madam Chair, the powers that CSIS has for countering threats go back to 1998, I believe. The changes were made then, and it's always evolving how we use those powers. As I mentioned earlier, generally, we don't work alone. We work with our partners to understand clearly the context of the situation and the impacts to ensure that we take the most specific action possible to deal with the threat. So we would not usually take action without consulting our agency, but before taking action. We heard that from our previous witnesses, that is Elections Canada and the Commissioner's Office, that they are not able to take specific action. So I would like to hear from you, since the Prime Minister seemed to brush aside the recommendation that more needed to be done. So is there enough power available to deal with these situations for CSIS? I mentioned in my opening remarks, Madam Chair, that foreign interference is taken seriously, and over the past few years, we have noted that the types and sophistication of foreign interference have evolved, have increased. They have learned how we work and the types of powers that we have and what we can do. And that is why we need to protect certain parts of our information. CSIS, the CSE, the RCMP, and the Commissioner's Office all have complementary powers. And do we need more tools in our toolbox? That's certainly something that we can look at. We work very well together, but there is certainly room for improvement.
Thank you. Mr. Julian?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for our witnesses, Monsieur Vigneault. I was tempted to ask the same question I asked yesterday, which is the articles by Robert Fife and Stephen Chase in the Globe and Mail and Sam Cooper in Global News. If you could acknowledge their factual articles, I don't believe you're willing to do that. However, I do want to ask whether the concerns around multiple Liberal and Conservative candidates being involved, potentially being favored by Beijing, if this is something that you can confirm, whether there are multiple Liberal and Conservative candidates that were of concern.
Madam Chair, I think the member has had the preview of my answers. I will not be able to speak specifically about who may or may not have been a subject of interference. What I can say, and we have said that publicly many times over the last number of years, is that foreign interference is the actors who are engaged in foreign interference against Canadians do so at all levels of government, at the federal, provincial, and municipal level, and they're doing it across party lines. The goal here for a country, organizations who want to interfere, is to favor their own interest, and therefore, whatever way they decide to determine that those interests would be pursued most effectively, they will engage, and that's why we have seen foreign interference across party lines and across different levels of government.
Now, I want to ask you, following up on Madame Romanado's question around foreign diplomats, when we have a case of a foreign diplomat that is involved in potentially provoking violations of our laws, in this case, the Canada Elections Act, what are the steps that CSIS can take in the case of that diplomat? What is open to the Canadian government as well?
So I would say probably, Madam Chair, I would structure my answer in two ways. First is what CSIS can do, which is we would investigate the information. We would pursue using all techniques to find as much as possible about the interference of diplomats based in Canada. When we have that information, then there's the options of the service taking the measures directly ourselves using our threat reduction mandate. But in the case of a foreign diplomat, it would. I do not foresee a scenario in which we would not engage GAC. Global Affairs Canada is the authority in Canada to ensure that the enforcement of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. They are the ones who are interacting on a day-to-day basis with foreign diplomats, and at that point, there are different tools the disposal of the government through Global Affairs Canada to be able to enforce the Vienna Convention, up to and including declaring someone persona non grata from the country. And so, again...
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. That responds to my question. You did say something that disturbed me a few minutes ago. You said, and I quote, I've got quotation marks around it, intelligence is not a question of evidence, making the distinction between intelligence you receive and evidence that the RCMP or the Commissioner of Elections can act on. So my question is, how do you validate intelligence then in that case to ensure that you're moving from intelligence to actual evidence that is actionable?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I'll respond if that's okay. We constantly work with our partners in law enforcement, as the Director mentioned, with the Commissioner of Canada Elections, and we share that information. We have those discussions, and they are really the ultimate authority to know what could be of use to them. The challenge for us and the challenge in the system currently is we need to be able to protect our methods of operation. We need to be able to protect our human sources, our technical sources, our employees. And so that sometimes poses challenges, as was mentioned by the panel yesterday, in terms of converting that intelligence into evidence. But the decision in terms of whether to use that information could belong to the Public Prosecutor Office. It could belong, of course, to our RCMP colleagues. And perhaps I'll turn to my RCMP colleague if there's anything he wants to add from his perspective in terms of sharing information. But I can say that it is a very close partnership, ongoing discussions, and we work quite closely with all involved agencies in trying to action that information.
OK. Je vais passer à ma prochaine question qui relève.
Now I will go to my next question that deals with the diaspora. You talked about the measures to decrease the threat of foreign interference. What are the measures you are undertaking with the diaspora? Namely, I'm talking here about the Chinese diaspora, but also with the Russian, Iranian diasporas. So, Madam Chair, it's a very good question. As mentioned in my opening remarks, it is a very sensitive issue and it is a priority for CSIS. Ethnocultural communities in Canada are being pressured when it comes to foreign interference. And to answer your question, in the last year, we've published a report on foreign interference. We've published it in the different Chinese dialects, in Persian and in Russian. We've released a guide for communities to better counter foreign interference. So this is a tool. It's a public information tool. We engage people to talk to us to see what more can be done.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We will now go for a 5-minute round. Madame Dancho, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. Regarding the specific allegations report in the Globe and Mail from CSIS documents that Beijing was responsible for illegal cash donations, tax receipts, and hiring campaign workers using illegal methods, as well as disinformation campaigns in the 2021 election. This information from CSIS would have been shared with our Five Eyes intelligence allies. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, as I mentioned earlier, I will not be in a position to comment specifically on these allegations, this information. What I can say, however, is that indeed CSIS and our intelligence partners do share information extensively with international partners. This foreign interference, amongst other threats, is one that is shared by many countries. The PRC specifically and other countries are engaging in foreign interference in other countries. And one of the advantage we have is having a number of countries in not only amongst the Five Eyes, but more broadly in Western Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East. We work very closely with these partners to share information. And that is one way we have to protect Canadians, is to benefit from the enriched picture here.
It was also, pardon me, it was also reported that a Consul General of Beijing took credit for the defeat of a Conservative MP in the 2021 election. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, I would unfortunately have to reiterate my answer. I cannot specifically confirm some of the information that is in the public domain in this current setting.
This has been asked, but I'll ask again. Was the Prime Minister briefed of any of this information, and when would that have been? What would have been the dates?
Madam Chair, we will be, as I in answer to the previous question, we endeavor to be able to provide information to the working with PCO to this committee in terms of what has been briefed and who has been briefed, but I'm not in a position to specifically answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Vigneault, and I appreciate your service to this country, but I am surprised. Of course, you were all aware that you were coming to this committee today, and I know you all take, I'm sure, very detailed notes in your calendar. So I'm a bit surprised that that information is not readily available to committee members, as I'm sure you anticipated the questions of when the Prime Minister would or would not have been briefed by you or others in CSIS, but I would appreciate if you would provide that in short order to the committee. Thank you. To the RCMP, has CSIS shared any of this information regarding election interference with you?
Any sharing of information would have been done through the site committee. And then if it falls into the criminal space, the RCMP would investigate.
And you're not investigating?
We're not investigating any elements from the 2019 or the 2021 elections. We did not receive any actionable intelligence that would warrant us to initiate a criminal investigation.
So no charges have been laid to anyone concerning any election interference, is that correct?
No charges have been laid.
And no charges have been laid concerning the Beijing police stations illegally operating in Canada for the purpose of terrorizing Chinese Canadians. No charges have been laid in that regard either?
No, but the RCMP has taken overt action on 4 specific sites where we were present in uniform marked vehicles to demonstrate to the community that we're taking this seriously. And we've had a positive impact on the actions that we've taken.
And that positive impact in particular, does that mean that the operations from those illegal Beijing police stations have ceased?
Our understanding is that they've ceased, and we're continuing our investigation of the ongoing. Anytime you have a representative from the embassy who's a law enforcement liaison officer comes up to us and not pleased with the actions we took, I think that's a sign that we did our job.
I appreciate your work very much in that regard. Yesterday, I believe it was shared in committee from the Deputy of Minister of Public Safety that legislative changes would need to be made, or he implied that they would need to be made for charges to be laid. Is that correct? That legislative changes would need to be made for the RCMP to lay charges. Is that correct?
When we talk about legislative changes, the RCMP operates in the criminal environment, and this is the work that Michelle alluded to earlier, my colleague, with regards to the work we do with the service. The service is in the intel business, but as the intel starts building towards a criminal offense, that's when it's shifted to the RCMP. So we work with the existing legislation that we have under the criminal code.
Thank you. Would a change to the criminal code be needed to lay charges based on the evidence that you have concerning the police stations or election interference?
We always entertain new tools under the code.
Has the Minister of Public Safety or anybody from government, the Prime Minister's office, been briefed that legislative changes would need to be made for charges to be laid?
Not to my knowledge.
None of those briefings have happened?
I'm saying not to my knowledge.
Okay, so the RCMP has not informed the Prime Minister or any of his cabinet that legislative changes are needed for charges to be laid?
The RCMP will go through public safety for any change in legislation.
Will you be pursuing any
you.
of those brief? Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for your feedback.
Excellent. And this brings us to Mr. Fergus.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I first want to thank our witnesses who are here with us today. I feel very encouraged to see the coordination between the RCMP, our CSIS partners. It's very important to see this coordination so that you are working together to protect Canadians and playing our part with our international partners. Mr. Vigneault, I want to come back to an answer you gave to Mr. Cooper when he talked about allegations that have come out in the media. If I remember correctly, you confirmed, you could not confirm the veracity of those allegations.
These allegations may or may not come from CSIS. And this leads me to a sensitive question. Now, I know you can't comment about the specific case, but so let me just take this into a hypothetical range. When you see, with your knowledge of foreign interference, and the different techniques which are used in foreign interference, is it possible, in your opinion, that unverified or unconfirmed leaks from secret sources that may or may not come from official sources could in itself represent a form of foreign interference? Madame la Présidente,
Madam Chair,
répondre en anglais. Si
I will answer in English, or rather in French, if you don't mind. I think that this is one of the key aspects of this whole situation. Foreign interference is very complex. There is a whole spectrum of activities that goes from a diplomat that might speak openly to exercise influence, and that would be acceptable. And then there is a whole category of activities that would be a gray area, that would be a little more secretive or would be revealed only later, and that would also be foreign interference in a way. So that's very complex, as you can see. So
United Front Work Department is the organization, UFWD, United Front Work Department, is an organization of the Communist Party. It is as old as the Chinese Communist Party. Under Xi Jinping, this organization, has been provided new budgets, and that now the budget of the organization dedicated to engage the Chinese abroad, but also to interfere in other countries' internal affairs that done by the FWD. The budget of that organization now is bigger than their entire Department of Foreign Affairs. So the budget of an organization dedicated to foreign interference is now larger than the entire overt diplomatic work that the PRC is engaging in. It gives you a sense of how important this is. And I would say very quickly, Madam Chair, this is why the President of China, Xi Jinping, calls the UFWD one of its magic weapons. So then it's not beyond reasonable to see that undermining democratic systems, democratic institutions could be a primary purpose of the UFWD. Chair, in terms of foreign interference writ large, carried out by the PRC, but also we have seen it by Russia, disinformation is one of this very specific tool that is being used. That is why, as an intelligence service, we have very rigorous processes to be able to ingest information, challenge that information, validate it, assess it, and that's how intelligence is then put together at the end. And so that I would just invite everybody to be mindful that, some of the information that may be in the public domain could be accurate, could also be information that is part of that process, that it's still part of an evaluation and assessment process. So this is why we are very concerned when we see this in the public domain, because, you need to have experts also be able to assess the specific information.
Thank you. Madame Normandin, 2 minutes et demi.
2.5 minutes for Ms. Normandin. I understand that you can't say whether or not the information that was provided to the Globe and Mail is accurate, but there is information that indicate that some CSIS officials may have leaked information about how information was managed with the PMO, and the Prime Minister has brushed aside the possibility that one of his candidates may have had interference work in his favor. So we've got these activities by the Communist Party of China, but I want to hear about whether there are any tensions between your organization and the Prime Minister and the PMO. Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, there are various aspects to that question. So I would like to quickly say that there is an investigation underway by CSIS and our partners regarding the sources of the information, the leak. We are in a democracy. People do have the right to speak freely. And as I said earlier, in response to a question, if there are means that exist already for people to express their discontent regarding relations with the Prime Minister's office, it is clear that our work is to inform the government, and we have every means available to us to do that. And so I can say that communication is open so that CSIS can provide all of the required information. Very quickly, I have little time, but on another issue, would it be useful for CSIS to have a registry of foreign officials and actors to be able to track down interference? Yes, Madam Chair. I had the opportunity to appear before a different parliamentary committee with Minister Mendocino a few weeks ago, and I would say in response to that question that yes, CSIS has been talking about foreign influence for the last few years, foreign interference, and I think that tool would be useful. It wouldn't solve all our problems, but it would increase transparency. Thank you. Mr. Julia.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I know that you can't share information about Five Eyes. That said, there are similar measures that have to be taken by our partners. If we look, for example, at Chinese interference, there are other examples, and I think they are fairly much public knowledge, and there are solutions in place, other places. When Donald Trump was elected, there was a lot of interference by Russia. The same occurred with Brexit in the United Kingdom. And we had the convoy, as it was called, here in Canada, and we know that Russia was involved in that. So what lessons can we draw from our partners on that, and how can we apply them in Canada? We talk about interference where the diaspora of people from other countries is concerned, but also within Canada, like the convoy. Thank you. Madam Chair, If I may, there were a few aspects that were mentioned that don't match the information that I have, including foreign interference in the convoy activities. That's not the information I have, but I can address lessons that we can draw from situations in other countries. Canada is very fortunate because we have a lot of partners and allies around the world. We work confidentially with other countries through Five Eyes, but also other means. The lessons concerning the register that was already mentioned, that's one that we can take from other countries. And there are things done in Canada that can be useful to other countries as well. Some of them are confidential, and this is how we build our partnerships. Thank you. We will now go to Mr. Berthold for 4 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Vigneault, I have a question for you. I'm a little bit of a novice when it comes to security levels and things. I asked the same question of Ms. Thomas. When information is provided to somebody in a political party that is classified, can that person provide information to others? That, Madam Chair, is one thing that we need to keep learning about and drawing lessons about, because that is one of the examples. The process isn't as clear as that. There are ways for people who have classified information to be able to share it in order to provide advice to people, just like we've got certain committees, but the actual information is classified. Is that correct? Yes, the specific information is classified. So if a person provides, shares that information, that is illegal, so to speak, if it is classified. Yes, specific information would probably be considered illegally shared. But in my experience, this is an information that needs to be held to see how the information can be used. Yes, I understand. There's a distinction between the specific information and advice. So if CSIS is investigating a specific candidate, then that information can't be shared. I understand the need for the committee members to have specific answers on to their questions, but I do have to just take a moment to say that it is not just a matter of providing the information and then washing our hands of it, but rather to provide it to along with means to use it. Yes, we understand that classified information under the current system remains classified, and it has to be classified and can't be shared. Madam Chair, very specific information can't be shared. That's correct. Mr. Vigneault, Ms. Thomas said that CSIS was informed a number of times of a number of complaints regarding foreign interference in 2019-21. Can you confirm that, or rather to the RCMP? No, it's very rare that information would be sent to us. Do you have any information that that any information was provided from ministers' offices and others? No. Any information that we would have would involve the site committee. Can you talk about foreign interference by Beijing in 2019-2021? Has anything come to your office? No? Neither to, you haven't provided information either to the minister or cabinet? No. If somebody did so without going through the regular channels, I wouldn't know. Well, just going by memory, that's one thing. But can you go through the communications with the cabinet and all others to make sure that that is not the case? Yes, I can commit to doing that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Merci, Mr. Berthold.
Thank you, Mr. Berthold.
Mrs. Sahota, you will have 4 minutes and 20 seconds.
Thank you. So many more questions and never enough time. I want to thank the witnesses first and foremost. At the beginning of the statements, it was mentioned that many Chinese Canadians become victim of this type of foreign interference that occurs. Would you also say that candidates could also become blindsided and victim of this type of foreign interference?
Canadians?
Candidates.
Madam Chair, sorry. I would say that the purpose of foreign interference is to, again, push an agenda of a foreign country. And so, as we have mentioned, it takes many different forms, and absolutely that could include engaging candidates, engaging staff, engaging people of different part of Canadian civil society. So, as we have said, everybody is potentially, depending on their position, could be subject to foreign interference.
And does your agency regularly inform parliamentarians, brief them on foreign interference and how to protect themselves, especially if a candidate may be a victim of foreign interference? Would your agency brief them about this, and have they done so in these occurrences in the past?
So, but Madam Chair, we do have briefed many parliamentarians across party lines, across different levels of government, as I mentioned before. We also continue to publicly speak about foreign interference. We have publications that exist in terms of specifically foreign interference, and the guide available in multiple of languages to help people to understand very concretely what foreign interference is and what they could do about that. And so the service, the CSIS has been engaged with our partners, and I believe that Chief also has examples.
Yes. Yes, thank you for the question. I would just add that since 2017, the CSC has been putting out publications with regards to threats to democratic institutions. And one of the things that we clearly outline in that booklet or in the guidance that we've provided to democratic institutions and around general elections is that foreign interference could happen to those that are voters, as well as candidates, as well as politicians. So as recently as the 2021 election as well.
Because I don't have that much time, I also wanted to get into more things. How many given countries might be involved in these types of activities in Canada? Do you have a ballpark figure of how many countries are involved?
So, Madam Chair, I would say that we have publicly acknowledged the interference activities of the PRC, of Iran, and of Russia, and there are other countries also involved in that, in foreign interference in our overall country, not just in the democratic electoral processes.
So there are a few countries that you acknowledge publicly, but how many countries? Is there a number, an idea? Is it a lot greater than 3, or is it just a few greater than 3?
Madam Chair, it's I would say that it is more than 3. We're not talking about every country engaging in these activities. Most countries do not resort to these types of actions, but indeed we are concerned about a few other countries.
Would a public inquiry be, and many of former directors of CSIS have commented on this recently, do you believe a public inquiry might be a good forum for us to continue this conversation? And do you think that CSIS and our country would have something to gain instead of having it in a committee hearing like this or at NCCOP or briefings to site. And we've seen that the Rosenberg report has recently come out, and I'm sure that you were involved in briefings with them in order for them to reach their conclusions. So having done all of these things and being engaged in these ways, do you think a public inquiry on top of that would be beneficial?
Madam Chair, I'd say that the goal of the focus of CSIS of the last number of years has been to publicly engage in talking about foreign interference. We're using all platforms available to us, including parliamentary committees. So whatever decision is made to continue this discussion, CSIS would be, of course, engaged actively in continuing the discussion. The one, of course, remaining consideration is the classified information. How can we find the best possible way of having classified information, part of a classified discussion, but inform the proper debate without becoming public? Is that the key conundrum?
So with that, I would like to thank all of our guests for coming. It's been really interesting. And something that I also often hear is, when does the public get to know these meetings are taking place in public? You've really demonstrated just the level of detail and just the layers of it. So I can speak for myself to say I appreciate that you are responsible for our security and that you are doing really important work. So I thank you. And for being available today, I thank you. And I'm going to let witnesses go so we can get to the next.
Well, just it's related to the witnesses. Just very briefly, Madam
Mr.
Chair,
Cooper.
Mr. Vigneault undertook to provide a consolidated response in consultation with PCO. I would ask that the clerk contact the PCO to request that that response be provided within a week. These are the briefings were matters that I think were easy to anticipate and would not require a significant amount of time for calendars to be checked.
So I think I appreciate that. And I have full confidence that everyone who is appearing here will get us information as quickly as possible. I have not found one person yet who does not take this matter seriously and who wants to ensure that our elections are protected, open and transparent and fair. So I would ask that you provide us information as quickly as possible to the clerk. If there's other information you would like to provide us to the clerk, and we'll make sure it's circulated to all members. With that, on behalf of committee members, thank you for your service, and to your teams, have a great day.